The gallery was packed with the city's most influential art collectors, critics, and photographers. Crystal champagne glasses clinked against each other as conversations flowed around stunning black and white portraits lining the pristine white walls. Marcus Chen stood near the back, his camera bag slung over his shoulder, watching his life's work being celebrated by strangers who had no idea he existed. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Ladies and gentlemen, the distinguished gallery owner, Victoria Ashford, called out over the crowd. Her silver hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and her voice commanded immediate attention. Before we continue our celebration of these remarkable photographs, I'd like to call forward the true artist behind this extraordinary collection. The room fell silent. Near the front, standing beside a towering portrait of a weathered fisherman's hands, stood Natalie Brooks. Her blonde hair cascaded over the shoulders of her designer black dress, and she wore the confident smile Marcus had once found so captivating. She began to step forward, ready to accept the recognition she'd stolen. Would Marcus Chen please? Come to the front. The color drained from Natalie's face so quickly that Marcus thought she might faint. Her hand gripped the wine glass so tightly her knuckles turned white. The confident smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure terror as 200 pairs of eyes began searching the crowd for the real photographer. Marcus had been waiting 3 years for this moment. It started on a rainy Tuesday evening in October, back when Seattle's perpetual drizzle still felt romantic rather than oppressive. Marcus was hunched over his laptop in the cramped studio apartment he shared with Natalie, carefully editing the final images of what would become his breakthrough portfolio. The amber glow from his desk lamp cast long shadows across the hardwood floor, and the soft clicking of his mouse was the only sound breaking the comfortable silence. He'd been working on this collection for 18 months, every weekend, every vacation day. Every spare moment had been devoted to capturing the raw humanity in forgotten corners of the Pacific Northwest. Weathered dock workers in Tacoma whose calloused hands told stories of decades spent battling the sea. Elderly Native American artisans in small reservation towns, their fingers weaving baskets with techniques passed down through generations. Street musicians in Pioneer Square whose weathered faces reflected both struggle and unshakable hope. The project had consumed him entirely. Marcus would drive hours into remote areas, sometimes sleeping in his beat-up Honda Civic just to catch the perfect golden hour light on his subjects' faces. He'd learned their names, their stories, their dreams. Each photograph was more than just an image. It was a piece of someone's soul he'd been trusted to preserve. Still working on those pictures? Natalie's voice drifted from the kitchen where she was preparing her usual Tuesday night salad. Her tone carried that familiar hint of impatience that had become increasingly common over the past year. Almost finished with the final edits, Marcus replied, not looking away from his screen. He was adjusting the contrast on a portrait of Elena Vasquez, an 82-year-old woman who'd been making tortillas by hand for 6 decades. Her eyes held such depth, such wisdom earned through years of joy and sorrow, that Marcus sometimes forgot to breathe when he looked at the image. "You've been saying that for months," Natalie said, appearing behind him with her salad bowl. She peered over his shoulder at the screen, and Marcus felt her body tense slightly. "These are actually really good, Marcus. Really, really good." At the time, her praise had filled him with warmth. Natalie worked in marketing for a high-end interior design firm, and she had an eye for visual aesthetics that Marcus respected. She understood composition, lighting, the subtle elements that separated amateur snapshots from professional artistry. Her approval meant everything to him. "You think so?" he asked, finally turning to face her. "I've been worried they're too raw, too honest. Some of these people, their stories are so heavy." Natalie set down her salad and leaned against his desk, her green eyes studying the images displayed across his dual monitors. "That's exactly what makes them powerful. Look at this one. She pointed to a portrait of James Clearwater, a Quinault elder whose face was mapped with lines that spoke of both laughter and loss. You can see his entire life in his expression. It's haunting. Marcus had spent 3 days with James, learning about his work preserving traditional fishing techniques and his struggle to pass cultural knowledge to younger generations who were increasingly drawn to city life. The photograph captured a moment when James was demonstrating how to repair traditional nets, his weathered hands moving with practiced precision while his eyes held the weight of fading traditions. "I want to call the collection Unseen Voices," Marcus said, turning back to his screen. "These are people who shape our communities but rarely get recognition. The night janitor who keeps downtown offices spotless, the early morning baker whose bread feeds hundreds of families, the bus driver who safely transports children to school every day for 30 years. It's beautiful work, Marcus. Really." Natalie's hand rested on his shoulder, and he could feel the genuine admiration in her touch. "What are you planning to do with them?" That was the question that had been keeping Marcus awake at night. He'd been a freelance photographer for 5 years, mostly shooting weddings and corporate events to pay the bills. His artistic work had always been personal, something he did for himself without any clear plan for sharing it with the world. But this collection felt different. It felt important. "I've been thinking about trying to get them into a gallery," he admitted. "Maybe start with some smaller venues, see if anyone's interested." Natalie nodded thoughtfully. "You should definitely try. These deserve to be seen by more people than just me and your camera club friends." Marcus smiled at the gentle teasing. His Thursday night photography group consisted of 6 other enthusiasts who met at a community center to share techniques and critiques. They were supportive and encouraging, but Natalie was right. They weren't exactly the art world establishment. Over the next several weeks, Marcus threw himself into preparing submission materials. He researched galleries throughout the Pacific Northwest, studying their previous exhibitions and artist profiles. He wrote and rewrote his artist statement, trying to capture in words what his images expressed visually. He printed test versions of key photographs, adjusting color profiles and paper types until each image perfectly matched his vision. The process was expensive. Professional printing costs, submission fees, and portfolio materials quickly ate through Marcus's modest savings. Some galleries required physical portfolios to be submitted in person, meaning gas money for trips to Portland, Olympia, and smaller art communities throughout Washington and Oregon. Natalie was supportive throughout the process, offering feedback on his artist statement and helping him research potential venues. She had connections in the design world that occasionally overlapped with fine art circles, and she promised to mention his work to anyone who might be able to help. Sarah from the studio mentioned that the Meridian Gallery downtown is looking for new photographers, she told him one evening in December. "I could introduce you if you want." Marcus felt a surge of gratitude. Natalie's willingness to leverage her professional network for his artistic dreams was just one of the reasons. He'd fallen in love with her. She believed in his work even when he doubted himself. The rejections came steadily throughout the winter. Polite form letters thanking him for his submission, but explaining that his work didn't align with our current exhibition calendar. Few galleries provided more detailed feedback. His technical skills were strong, but the subject matter was perhaps too documentary for their clientele, or the collection lacked commercial appeal. Each rejection stung, but Marcus pressed on. He understood that breaking into the art world required persistence and thick skin. Every successful photographer he'd researched had faced similar challenges early in their career. "Don't let it discourage you," Natalie would say after each disappointing email arrived. "The right gallery just hasn't seen your work yet." By February, Marcus had submitted to 17 galleries across the region. He'd received 16 rejections and was waiting on one final response from a prestigious venue in Portland called the Cascade Contemporary Gallery. Their website showcased exactly the kind of meaningful, socially conscious photography that Marcus hoped his work represented. He was checking his email obsessively, refreshing his inbox every few minutes while trying to focus on editing a wedding he'd shot the previous weekend. The bride and groom looked happy in their formal portraits, but Marcus found himself distracted, thinking about Elena Vasquez's knowing smile or James Clearwater's weathered hands. "Any word from Portland?" Natalie asked, settling onto the couch beside him with her laptop. "Not yet," Marcus replied, clicking refresh again. "Their website says they respond within 6 to 8 weeks, and it's been exactly 7. They're probably just being thorough," she said, opening her own computer. "Good galleries take time to properly evaluate submissions." Marcus nodded, trying to stay optimistic. The Cascade Contemporary Gallery represented exactly the kind of artists he hoped to become. Photographers who used their craft to highlight social issues and celebrate overlooked communities. Getting accepted there would be more than just professional validation. It would mean his work had found its proper home. That night, as Natalie worked on client presentations and Marcus continued editing wedding photos, a comfortable domesticity settled over their small apartment. These quiet evenings had become precious to Marcus. The early stages of their relationship had been filled with excitement and adventure, late-night conversations about art and life, spontaneous road trips to capture sunrise over mountain lakes, shared dreams about the future they'd built together. Now, 3 years in, their love had matured into something steadier and more practical. They supported each other's careers, shared household responsibilities, and talked increasingly about long-term plans. Marcus had been thinking about proposing, maybe later that year when his photography career was more established. "I've been thinking," Natalie said, not looking up from her screen. "If the Portland Gallery doesn't work out, maybe you should consider a different approach." "What do you mean?" "Well, you've been focusing on traditional galleries, but there are other ways to get recognition. Online platforms, photography competitions, maybe even social media if you do it right." Marcus considered this. He'd been somewhat old-fashioned in his approach, believing that serious art belonged in physical galleries with proper lighting and curatorial context. But Natalie had a point. The art world was changing, and digital platforms were creating new opportunities for emerging artists. "I want to try a few more traditional venues first," he said. "But you're right. I should probably expand my strategy." "I could help you with the marketing side," Natalie offered. "That's literally what I do all day at work. I know how to present creative projects in ways that get attention. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel." Now, back to where we left off. The offer was generous and practical. Natalie's expertise in visual marketing and brand development could be exactly what Marcus needed to present his work more effectively. He'd always struggled with the business side of photography, preferring to focus on the artistic elements. "That would be amazing," he said, feeling a rush of appreciation for this woman who continued to surprise him with her support and insight. As they worked side by side that evening, Marcus felt optimistic about the future. Whether the Portland Gallery accepted his work or not, he had a partner who believed in his vision and skills to help him succeed. The Unseen Voices collection represented his best work to date, and with Natalie's help, he was confident it would eventually find the audience it deserved. He had no idea that his trust was about to become the weapon used to destroy everything he'd worked for. The acceptance email from Cascade Contemporary Gallery arrived on a Thursday morning in March, buried beneath spam messages and client inquiries in Marcus's overflowing inbox. He almost missed it entirely, dismissing the sender as another automated rejection until he noticed the subject line. Unseen Voices, Portfolio Submission, Accepted. His hands trembled as he opened the message, reading it 3 times before the words fully registered. Not only had they accepted his work, but the gallery director, Catherine Morrison, described his collection as powerful documentation of human dignity and exactly the kind of socially conscious artistry our community needs. "Natalie!" Marcus shouted across their apartment, his voice cracking with emotion. "They said yes! Portland said yes!" She emerged from the bathroom, toothbrush still in her mouth, eyes wide with surprise. After spitting into the sink, she rushed over to read the email over his shoulder. Her reaction was everything Marcus had hoped for: genuine excitement, pride, and that radiant smile that had first captivated him at a coffee shop 3 years earlier. "This is incredible, Marcus. I'm so proud of you." She wrapped her arms around him from behind, and he could feel her heart beating rapidly against his back. What happens next? According to Catherine Morrison's detailed email, the exhibition would run for 6 weeks, starting in late May. Marcus would need to provide 42 final prints in specific dimensions, write extended artist statements for each piece, and participate in an opening reception where he'd discuss his work with collectors and critics. The financial requirements were substantial. Professional mounting and framing for 42 photographs would cost nearly $3,000. The artist statements needed to be professionally typeset and printed on archival paper. Transportation costs for multiple trips to Portland, accommodation during the installation week, and appropriate clothing for gallery events added up quickly. Marcus stared at his bank account balance, doing rapid mental calculations. His wedding photography had been slower than usual during the winter months, and the 18 months spent on Unseen Voices had meant turning down paid assignments. Even with careful budgeting, he was at least $1,500 short of what he needed. "I might have to ask the gallery if they can help with costs," he said, scrolling through his modest savings. "Absolutely not," Natalie said firmly. "This is your big break. You can't start the relationship by asking for financial help." She was right. Professional artists were expected to handle exhibition costs themselves, and asking for assistance would signal either inexperience or financial instability. Neither impression would help Marcus build his career. "I could take on extra wedding shoots," he suggested, though the timeline was tight. "Or," Natalie said slowly, "I could help cover the costs. Consider it an investment in our future." Marcus turned to face her, surprised by the offer. Natalie was careful with money, budgeting meticulously and rarely making impulsive purchases. Her willingness to invest in his career moved him more than any declaration of love could have. "I can't ask you to do that." "You're not asking. I'm offering." She sat down beside him, taking his hands in hers. "Marcus, I've watched you pour everything into this project. Your passion, your talent, your time. If I can help make it successful, then we both benefit." The logic was sound. If Marcus's career took off, their shared financial future would improve dramatically. Gallery representation often led to private commissions, teaching opportunities, and book deals. The initial investment could pay dividends for years to come. Over the following weeks, Natalie proved instrumental in preparing for the exhibition. She researched professional framing services, negotiating better rates by bundling the entire order. She helped Marcus write and revise his artist statements, using her marketing expertise to make each description more compelling without losing artistic integrity. "You're describing the technical aspects but not the emotional impact," she explained as they worked on the statement for James Clearwater's portrait. "Collectors want to understand why this image matters, not just how you created it." Her feedback transformed Marcus's writing. Where he'd originally written, "This portrait captures traditional net-mending techniques practiced by the Quinault people," Natalie helped him expand it to, "James Clearwater's weathered hands move with practiced precision," each knot representing not just technical skill but cultural knowledge passed down through generations. His eyes hold the weight of traditions threatened by modernity, making him both teacher and guardian of disappearing wisdom. The collaborative process brought them closer together. They spent evenings at Marcus's computer, Natalie reading drafts, aloud while Marcus refined the language. She had an intuitive understanding of which details would resonate with gallery visitors, and her suggestions consistently improved his work. "You should write professionally," Marcus told her one evening, after she'd helped him craft a particularly powerful statement about Elena Vasquez. "I do write professionally," she laughed. "Marketing copy, client presentations, campaign strategies. It's not that different from this, actually. We're both trying to make people care about something." As the exhibition date approached, Marcus threw himself into printing and preparation with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He spent entire days at the professional printing lab, working with technicians to ensure each photograph perfectly matched his vision. The process was meticulous and expensive, with multiple test prints required to achieve the correct color balance and contrast. The images looked stunning on professional archival paper. Elena's tortilla-making hands seemed to glow with inner light, while James Clearwater's portrait held depths that drew viewers into contemplation. Each photograph in the collection revealed new details under proper gallery lighting, justifying every hour Marcus had spent in post-production. Natalie accompanied him to Portland for the installation week. The Cascade Contemporary Gallery occupied a converted warehouse in the Pearl District, with soaring ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the space with natural light. Catherine Morrison, the gallery director, was a distinguished woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and an extensive knowledge of contemporary photography. "Your work has real emotional resonance," she told Marcus as they planned the exhibition layout. "We've had several advance inquiries from collectors who saw the announcement in our newsletter." The installation process took 3 days. Each photograph required careful positioning to maximize natural light while avoiding glare. The sequence mattered enormously. Visitors needed to experience the collection as a cohesive narrative rather than random portraits. Marcus and Natalie worked alongside gallery staff, adjusting placement and lighting until every image was perfectly displayed. Seeing his work professionally mounted and lit was overwhelming. These photographs, which had lived on his computer screen for months, now commanded attention in ways he'd only imagined. "It's incredible, Marcus," Natalie whispered as they walked through the completed exhibition during a final check. "Seeing them all together like this, it's like walking through these people's lives." The opening reception was scheduled for the following Friday evening. Catherine had invited Portland's most influential collectors, along with art critics from local publications and photography enthusiasts from the broader community. For Marcus, it represented his introduction to the professional art world. They returned to Seattle for the week between installation and opening, giving Marcus time to prepare for his first gallery talk. He practiced his presentation in their apartment, with Natalie playing the role of interested collector, asking probing questions about his artistic process. "Remember," she coached him, "people want to connect with you as much as your work. Don't just explain techniques. Share why these subjects matter to you personally." Her guidance was invaluable. Marcus had always been more comfortable behind the camera than in front of people, but Natalie helped him find ways to discuss his work that felt natural and engaging. The night before the opening, as they packed for their return trip to Portland, Marcus felt a complex mixture of excitement and terror. This exhibition represented everything he'd worked toward as an artist, but it also felt like stepping into unknown territory. What if nobody comes? He asked, folding his one good suit into their shared suitcase. "They'll come," Natalie assured him. "Catherine wouldn't have accepted your work if she didn't believe it would attract an audience. What if they come but nobody buys anything? Then you'll have successfully shared important work with people who needed to see it. That's what art is supposed to do." Her confidence was infectious. Natalie had become more than just a supportive partner. She was his artistic collaborator, business advisor, and emotional anchor. Marcus couldn't imagine navigating this milestone without her. As they drove toward Portland the next morning, Natalie handled logistics while Marcus focused on his presentation. She'd made reservations at a restaurant near the gallery for after the reception, booked their hotel room, and even researched the backgrounds of key collectors who might attend. Sarah Martinez owns 3 local restaurants and collects documentary photography, she read from her notes. Robert Chen, no relation to you, made his money in tech and focuses on Pacific Northwest artists. Angela Rodriguez runs a nonprofit, supporting immigrant communities and might connect personally with your subjects. The level of preparation impressed Marcus. Natalie approached his career with the same strategic thinking she applied to her marketing clients, identifying opportunities and potential connections that Marcus would never have considered. They arrived at the gallery 2 hours before the reception began. Marcus checked the lighting one final time while Natalie helped arrange refreshments and greet early arrivals. She seemed completely at ease in the gallery environment, moving through the space with natural confidence. "You clean up nice," she told Marcus as he adjusted his tie for the 3rd time. She looked stunning in a black dress that struck the perfect balance between artistic and professional. As 7 o'clock approached and guests began arriving, Marcus positioned himself near the entrance to greet visitors. His hands were sweating, and his heart raced with nervous energy. But seeing familiar faces in the crowd, James Clearwater had made the trip from the reservation, and Elena Vasquez had brought her entire family, reminded him why this work mattered. The evening that followed would change everything, though not in ways Marcus could have anticipated. As he watched Natalie circulate through the crowd, discussing his photographs with apparent expertise and genuine passion, he felt grateful for her partnership in ways that went beyond romantic love. She had made this exhibition possible, not just financially, but intellectually and emotionally. Her contributions had elevated his work and his presentation of it. Standing in that gallery, surrounded by his photographs and supported by the woman he loved, Marcus felt like the luckiest artist alive. Within 6 months, he would discover just how naive that feeling had been. The Portland exhibition exceeded every expectation Marcus had dared to harbor. By the 3rd week, 7 photographs had sold to private collectors, generating enough revenue to cover all exhibition costs with a modest profit remaining. More importantly, 3 additional galleries had reached out requesting portfolio submissions, and a regional photography magazine wanted to feature his work in their autumn issue. Marcus should have been celebrating. Instead, he found himself increasingly unsettled by small inconsistencies that didn't quite add up. It started with the business cards. During the opening reception, several collectors had approached Marcus asking for his contact information. He'd fumbled through his wallet, realizing too late that he'd forgotten to bring professional cards. Natalie had smoothly stepped in, producing elegant cards with his name and portfolio information printed in clean, modern typography. "When did you have these made?" he asked her later that evening as they walked back to their hotel. "Last week, while you were at the printing lab," she replied. "I figured you'd need them and didn't want you to have to worry about another detail." The gesture was thoughtful, exactly the kind of forward-thinking support that made Natalie such an incredible partner. But something about the cards nagged at Marcus. The design was sophisticated, more polished than anything he would have created for himself. The font choices, the paper quality, even the subtle texture. It all spoke to a level of design expertise that went beyond basic marketing knowledge. A week after returning to Seattle, Marcus received a follow-up email from Angela Rodriguez, the nonprofit director who'd attended the opening. She praised the exhibition and mentioned how impressed she'd been with the artist's representative, who'd provided such detailed insights into the creative process and social impact of each photograph. Marcus read the email twice, confused by the phrasing. He forwarded it to Natalie with a laughing emoji. "Apparently, you're my official representative now." Her response came quickly. "Lol, I guess I got carried away talking about your work. People seemed genuinely interested in the stories behind each photo." The explanation made sense. Natalie had been present for every discussion about the portfolio, had helped write the artist's statements, and genuinely understood the subjects and themes. Of course, she could speak knowledgeably about his work. Marcus dismissed the slight unease he felt and focused on preparing submissions for the galleries that had expressed interest. The unease returned a month later, when Marcus received a LinkedIn connection request from David Park, a gallery owner from Vancouver who'd apparently attended the Portland exhibition. His message read, "Great meeting you in Portland. Looking forward to seeing more of your collaborative work with Natalie Brooks. Her artistic vision really elevated the technical aspects of your photography." Marcus stared at the message, trying to remember meeting David Park. The opening reception had been crowded, with dozens of conversations, but he usually remembered other gallery professionals. More puzzling was the reference to collaborative work and Natalie's artistic vision. While she'd certainly contributed to the presentation and marketing, calling it collaborative work seemed like an overstatement. When he mentioned the message to Natalie, she seemed surprised. "David Park? I don't remember meeting anyone by that name either. Maybe he's thinking of someone else?" They agreed it was probably a case of mistaken identity or confused recollections from a busy evening. Marcus accepted the connection request but didn't follow up on the gallery inquiry. The third incident was more difficult to dismiss. Marcus was updating his website with images from the Portland exhibition when he decided to research what other people were saying about his work online. A simple Google search for Unseen Voices Photography Exhibition returned the expected results: the gallery's announcement, a brief review in Portland Art Monthly, and social media posts from attendees. But buried on the second page of results was a blog post from an art collector named Timothy Walsh, who'd attended the opening. His detailed review praised the exhibition, but one paragraph made Marcus's stomach drop. The most impressive aspect of the evening was meeting the creative team behind Unseen Voices. While Marcus Chen handled the technical photography, it was clear that Natalie Brooks provided the conceptual framework and artistic direction that elevated these portraits from simple documentation to profound social commentary. Their partnership demonstrates how collaborative artistic practice can produce work that neither individual could achieve alone. Marcus read the paragraph multiple times, each reading making him feel more confused and uncomfortable. He'd never met Timothy Walsh, had no memory of being introduced as part of a creative team, and certainly hadn't described his work as collaborative in that way. He showed the blog post to Natalie, expecting her to be as baffled as he was. Instead, she seemed annoyed. "This is exactly why I hate these industry events," she said, barely glancing at the screen. "People overhear fragments of conversations and construct entire narratives. I probably mentioned helping you with the artist statements, and this guy turned it into some grand collaboration." Her explanation was plausible, but Marcus noticed she'd closed his laptop rather quickly, as if she didn't want to discuss it further. When he tried to bring up the topic again later that evening, she changed the subject to their upcoming weekend plans. The fourth incident happened in May, 2 months after the Portland exhibition. Marcus was having lunch with his photography group when Jennifer Kim, one of the regular members, mentioned seeing his work referenced in an art blog she followed. It was about emerging photographers who are redefining documentary work, she explained. "They featured your fisherman portrait, but I thought it was weird that they credited both you and Natalie as co-artists." Marcus's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "What do you mean, co-artists?" The caption said something like Unseen Voices, series by Marcus Chen and Natalie Brooks. "I assumed you'd started working together officially, but it seemed strange that you hadn't mentioned it to the group." That evening, Marcus spent 2 hours searching for the blog post Jennifer had mentioned. He found it on a respected photography website that specialized in emerging talent. The article featured work from 12 photographers, with one image from each artist's portfolio. His contribution was the portrait of James Clearwater, but the credit line read, "From the Unseen Voices series by Marcus Chen and Natalie Brooks. Marcus felt a chill run through him as he stared at the screen. This wasn't a case of confused recollections or overheard conversations. Someone had deliberately provided his work to this publication with joint attribution. The only person who had access to his high-resolution files and detailed information about the project was Natalie. When she arrived home from her yoga class, Marcus was still sitting at his computer, the blog post displayed on his screen. "We need to talk about this," he said, his voice carefully controlled. Natalie looked at the screen, and for just a moment her expression flickered with something Marcus couldn't quite identify. Guilt? Fear? Then her features rearranged into familiar irritation. "This is getting ridiculous, Marcus. I had nothing to do with this." "Then how did they get my photograph? And why would they credit both of us unless someone told them we were collaborators?" "I have no idea. Maybe the Portland Gallery provided the information incorrectly. Maybe the blogger made assumptions based on other articles. There could be a dozen explanations." Marcus wanted to believe her, but the inconsistencies were accumulating beyond the point of coincidence. The business cards that appeared without his knowledge, the collector who described Natalie as his representative, the gallery owner who referenced their collaborative work, the blogger who credited her artistic vision. Now this photography website with joint attribution. "Natalie, I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you been presenting yourself as my collaborator or co-artist to anyone?" The question hung in the air between them. Marcus watched her face carefully, looking for any sign of deception. What he saw was anger. "I can't believe you're asking me this," she said, her voice rising. "After everything I've done to support your career, you're accusing me of trying to steal credit for your work? I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm asking for clarification about these mixed messages people seem to be getting. The mixed messages are coming from confused people at crowded events making assumptions. I've supported your work. I've helped present it professionally, and apparently some people have interpreted that as meaning I'm your creative partner. But I never claimed to be anything other than someone who believes in your talent." Her response felt practiced, too smooth. Marcus had known Natalie for 3 years and had seen her navigate difficult conversations with clients and colleagues. She was skilled at deflection and reframing, at making other people feel unreasonable for questioning her version of events. "Can you contact these publications and ask them to correct the attribution?" Marcus asked. "Of course," Natalie replied. "Immediately. I'll email them tomorrow and explain the confusion. This whole thing is probably just a series of misunderstandings that got amplified." Marcus nodded, wanting to believe that explanation. But as Natalie moved around their apartment, preparing for bed with her usual efficiency, he found himself studying her behavior with new attention. The way she avoided meeting his eyes, the slight tension in her shoulders, the careful modulation of her voice. That night, after Natalie had fallen asleep, Marcus lay awake staring at the ceiling. He replayed conversations from the past several months, looking for clues he might have missed. Natalie's increasing expertise in discussing his work, her sophisticated understanding of artistic presentation, her connections with people in galleries and design firms. He remembered the night she'd offered to help with marketing and presentation, claiming it wasn't that different from her day job. At the time, her expertise had seemed like a wonderful gift. Now he wondered if her knowledge went deeper than she'd admitted. Marcus pulled out his phone and did something he'd never done before. He searched for information about Natalie's background. Her LinkedIn profile showed her current position at the interior design firm, but her education section listed a Bachelor of Fine Arts from the University of Washington, with a concentration in photography. Marcus sat up in bed, his heart racing. Natalie had never mentioned studying photography. In 3 years of dating, through countless conversations about art and creativity, she'd never once indicated that she had formal training in his field. She'd always presented herself as someone who appreciated visual aesthetics but had no direct experience creating art. He scrolled through her profile more carefully. Her work history showed internships at 2 Seattle galleries during college, followed by positions at marketing firms that specialized in arts organizations. This wasn't someone who'd stumbled into understanding the art world. This was someone who'd built a career around it. Marcus felt like he was seeing a completely different person than the woman he'd fallen in love with. The supportive partner who'd helped elevate his work might actually be someone with her own artistic ambitions and professional expertise that she'd deliberately hidden from him. But why would she conceal such relevant experience? And more troubling, why were other people starting to credit her as his collaborative partner? The next morning, Marcus watched Natalie get ready for work with new eyes. She moved through their shared space with practiced efficiency, checking her phone while drinking coffee, gathering materials for client meetings. She seemed completely normal, but Marcus now wondered what else he didn't know about her. "Don't forget to contact those publications about the attribution error," he said as she headed toward the door. "Already on my to-do list," she replied, kissing him quickly on the cheek. "This whole thing will be cleared up by the end of the week." After she left, Marcus opened his laptop and began conducting more systematic research. He searched for any online presence Natalie might have under her name, looking for portfolio websites, social media accounts, or professional profiles he'd never seen. What he found made his hands shake. On Behance, a portfolio platform used by creative professionals, Natalie Brooks had an account showcasing photography work dating back 5 years. The images were sophisticated, technically proficient, and stylistically similar to documentary photography. Not identical to Marcus's approach, but clearly created by someone with serious artistic training and vision. The most recent uploads were from 3 months ago, just after the Portland exhibition. The portfolio now included several images that looked suspiciously familiar. Marcus clicked on a photograph that made his breath catch in his throat. It was Elena Vasquez, the tortilla-making woman whose portrait had been one of the centerpieces of his Unseen Voices collection. But this wasn't his photograph. The angle was different. The lighting slightly altered. The composition shifted. Someone else had been there during his session with Elena, taking their own photographs of the same subject. As Marcus scrolled through more images, a horrifying picture began to emerge. Portrait after portrait showed his subjects: James Clearwater, the dock workers from Tacoma, the street musicians from Pioneer Square, all photographed from different angles, with different compositions, but clearly taken during the same sessions where Marcus had created his Unseen Voices collection. Natalie had been there. She'd brought her own camera. She'd been creating her own portfolio using his subjects, his research, his relationships, and he'd been completely unaware. Marcus felt sick as the full scope of the deception became clear. While he'd been focused on his own photography, believing Natalie was simply supporting his work, she'd been documenting the same subjects for her own artistic purposes. Every person he'd met, every story he'd uncovered, every carefully built relationship, she'd been there quietly building her own version of his project. The timeline was devastating. Natalie's Behance portfolio showed uploads dating throughout the 18 months Marcus had been working on Unseen Voices. She'd been developing her own collection in parallel, using his access and connections, while presenting herself as merely a supportive girlfriend. But why keep it secret? Why not tell him she was also interested in photography? Why hide her expertise and formal training? As Marcus continued scrolling through her portfolio, he found a project description that made him understand the true scope of her deception. Unseen Voices, a collaborative documentary project exploring dignity and resilience in overlooked communities throughout the Pacific Northwest. This ongoing series, developed in partnership with Marcus Chen, seeks to honor the stories of individuals whose contributions to our society often go unrecognized. She'd already reframed their relationship as a collaboration. She'd positioned herself as co-creator of the project he'd conceived and developed independently. And according to the timestamps, she'd been building this narrative for months, long before any confusion had arisen at gallery events. Marcus realized he'd been played with sophisticated precision. Natalie hadn't simply supported his career. She'd infiltrated it, systematically positioning herself as his creative partner while he remained oblivious to her true agenda. His phone buzzed with a text from Natalie. "Meeting running late tonight. Don't wait up for dinner. Love you." Marcus stared at the message, wondering if she was actually in a meeting or working on her secret portfolio. How many other lies had he accepted without question? How long had she been building toward this moment? As he sat in their apartment, surrounded by evidence of a deception he was only beginning to understand, Marcus realized that everything he thought he knew about his relationship, his career, and his artistic success was built on lies, and somehow he suspected this was only the beginning. Marcus didn't sleep that night. Instead, he methodically documented everything he'd discovered, taking screenshots of Natalie's Behance portfolio and cross-referencing the images with his own contact sheets and session notes. By dawn, he had assembled a devastating timeline that revealed the true scope of her deception. The evidence was irrefutable. Every subject in his Unseen Voices collection appeared in Natalie's portfolio, often photographed within minutes of his own shots based on lighting conditions and background details. She hadn't just been present during his sessions. She'd been systematically creating her own competing body of work using his research, his relationships, and his artistic vision. But Marcus needed to understand the full extent of her plan. If Natalie had been building toward something specific, there would be more evidence beyond the Behance portfolio. He began searching deeper, using techniques he'd learned during his journalism minor in college. First, he checked domain registration, records for any websites associated with Natalie's name. What he found made his stomach clench. 3 months earlier, she'd registered nataliebrooksphotography.com and unseenvoicescollection.com. The second domain was particularly troubling. She'd essentially claimed ownership of his project. Title. The websites themselves were still under construction, showing only placeholder pages, but their existence confirmed that Natalie was planning something much larger than a simple portfolio. This level of preparation suggested months of strategic planning. Marcus then searched for any professional listings or directory entries under Natalie's name. He found her listed in 2 photography databases as a documentary photographer specializing in social justice themes. The descriptions were eerily similar to how he would describe his own work. Most disturbing was a listing on a freelance photographer directory that had been updated just 2 weeks earlier. Natalie's profile claimed 5 years of experience in collaborative documentary projects and listed Unseen Voices as her primary portfolio, with Marcus mentioned only as a technical partner. Technical partner. The phrase hit Marcus like a physical blow. She'd systematically repositioned their relationship, transforming herself from supportive girlfriend to creative collaborator to primary artist, with him relegated to a supporting role in his own project. But how far had this narrative spread? Marcus began searching for any other mentions of their supposed collaboration in photography blogs, gallery newsletters, or professional networks. What he discovered was a carefully orchestrated campaign to establish Natalie as the conceptual force behind Unseen Voices. An art blog post from April described her as the visionary behind the acclaimed Unseen Voices series, working with photographer Marcus Chen to document overlooked communities. A photography forum discussion from May included a comment from someone claiming to have met the real creative force behind the project. Natalie Brooks has an incredible eye for finding subjects with powerful stories. The comments and posts weren't random. They showed a pattern of deliberate reputation building. Someone had been systematically planting these narratives across multiple platforms, creating a digital paper trail that supported Natalie's version of events. Marcus realized he needed help. This was beyond amateur investigation. He was dealing with someone who understood digital marketing and reputation management at a professional level. He called his friend Derek Martinez, a freelance IA web developer who specialized in online reputation analysis for small businesses. "I need you to help me trace some online activity," Marcus explained when Derek answered. "Someone might be manipulating search results and social media to misrepresent my work." Derek agreed to meet that afternoon. When Marcus showed him the evidence he'd compiled, Derek's expression grew increasingly serious. "This isn't random or accidental," Derek confirmed after reviewing the materials. "Someone with serious digital marketing skills has been working on this for months. Look at the timing of these posts and the way they're strategically placed across different platforms." Derek pulled up several analytics tools, showing Marcus how search engine results were being influenced by the coordinated posting campaign. Someone had been carefully building Natalie's online presence while simultaneously diminishing Marcus's individual credit for the work. "The most concerning thing," Derek continued, "is this pattern here." He pointed to a series of forum comments and blog responses. "These aren't organic discussions. Someone has been using multiple accounts to seed conversations that support this collaborative narrative." Marcus felt a chill as Derek demonstrated how several seemingly independent comments actually originated from the same IP address range. Natalie hadn't just been passively benefiting from confusion. She'd been actively manufacturing evidence to support her claims. "How long would something like this take to set up?" Marcus asked. "To do it professionally?" "Months of consistent work. This person understands SEO, social media algorithms, and reputation management. They've been building a case." Derek's analysis confirmed Marcus's worst fears. This wasn't opportunistic credit stealing. It was a methodical campaign to rewrite the history of his artistic work. But for what purpose? What was Natalie's endgame? That evening, Marcus made a decision that felt like betraying his own privacy. He needed to access Natalie's email and social media accounts to understand the full scope of her plan. He knew her passwords. They'd shared login information for practical reasons throughout their relationship. What he found in her email account was worse than anything he'd imagined. The first shocking discovery was an email thread with Catherine Morrison from the Cascade Contemporary Gallery. The messages, dating back to February, showed Natalie had been in direct contact with the gallery director, discussing potential future exhibitions of her work. "Dear Catherine," one email read, "Thank you for your interest in my ongoing Unseen Voices project. I'm excited to discuss how we might present this work in a solo exhibition that properly showcases the conceptual framework I've developed over the past 2 years. Solo exhibition. Conceptual framework she'd developed. Marcus had to read the email 3 times before the implications were fully registered. Natalie wasn't just stealing credit for his work. She was planning to exhibit her parallel portfolio as her own original project. Catherine's response was equally devastating. "Natalie, your collaborative approach with Marcus Chen produced such powerful results at our spring exhibition. I'd be very interested in seeing how your individual artistic vision develops this documentary style further." The gallery director clearly believed that Natalie had been the creative force behind the Portland exhibition, with Marcus serving as a technical collaborator. Someone had systematically misrepresented their working relationship during or after the opening reception, but the email thread continued into more recent territory. Just 2 weeks earlier, Natalie had sent Catherine a formal exhibition proposal for a show titled Unseen Voices, A Personal Journey Through America's Hidden Communities. The proposal described an 18-month project documenting overlooked individuals whose stories embody resilience and dignity. It was Marcus's project, described in his own words from his original artist statement, but presented as Natalie's independent vision. She'd even included several of the photographs Marcus recognized from her secret portfolio. Images of his subjects, taken during his sessions, but credited as her original work. Catherine's response was enthusiastic. "This looks like exactly the kind of socially conscious work our patrons appreciate. Let's schedule a call to discuss timing and logistics." Marcus discovered that the call had already taken place. A follow-up. Email confirmed that Natalie had secured a solo exhibition at Cascade Contemporary Gallery for September, just 4 months away. She'd done this without his knowledge, using his work and his subjects to launch her own artistic career. But the deception went even deeper. In her sent folder, Marcus found emails to several of his subjects, reaching out to them directly without his knowledge. The messages were carefully crafted to seem collaborative, while subtly positioning her as the primary contact for future photography projects. An email to James Clearwater read, "Dear James, I hope you're well. As we discussed during our photo sessions last year, I'm continuing to develop the Unseen Voices project and would love to schedule some additional time with you. Your story is such an important part of this documentary series, as we discussed." Our photo sessions. Marcus had never heard Natalie have a direct conversation with James beyond basic pleasantries. She'd positioned herself as having an independent relationship with his subjects, creating a foundation for future work that excluded him entirely. Similar emails had been sent to Elena Vasquez, several of the dock workers, and the street musicians. In each case, Natalie presented herself as the primary photographer continuing an ongoing project, with no mention of Marcus's role or original conception of the work. The most devastating email was to Elena Vasquez, sent just 3 days earlier. "Dear Elena, I'm so excited to let you know that your portrait will be featured in my upcoming solo exhibition at the Cascade Contemporary Gallery this September. This show will celebrate the incredible people I've had the privilege to photograph over the past 2 years. My upcoming solo exhibition. The incredible people I've had the privilege to photograph." She'd completely erased Marcus from the narrative, transforming his 18-month project into her own artistic achievement. Marcus's hands were shaking as he scrolled through more emails. He found correspondence with photography magazines, gallery directors in other cities, and arts organizations, all presenting Natalie as the sole creator of Unseen Voices. She'd been pitching articles, seeking additional exhibition opportunities, and building professional relationships based entirely on work that wasn't hers. One email exchange with Seattle Art Monthly was particularly galling. The magazine's editor had reached out after seeing the Portland exhibition, interested in featuring emerging documentary photographers. Natalie's response positioned her as a solo artist who'd been developing her signature style for several years, with no mention of Marcus or their relationship. "My work focuses on revealing the dignity in overlooked communities," she'd written. "The Unseen Voices series represents 2 years of building trust with subjects who rarely have their stories told with the respect they deserve." Building trust with subjects. Marcus remembered every conversation, every carefully negotiated photo session, every relationship he'd developed with these individuals. Natalie had been present for many of these interactions, but always as his girlfriend, never as an independent photographer developing her own relationships. The email trail revealed that she'd been using his connections, his research, and his reputation to build her own career while systematically erasing his contributions. But the scope went beyond simple credit theft. She was positioning herself as the originator of his entire artistic approach. In her Gmail drafts folder, Marcus found an unsent email that made his blood run cold. It was addressed to Victoria Ashford, the director of a prestigious gallery in San Francisco, and dated just 1 week earlier. "Dear Victoria, I'm writing to introduce my documentary photography series, Unseen Voices, which has been gaining recognition throughout the Pacific Northwest. This project represents my evolving interest in social justice photography and my commitment to amplifying marginalized voices. I believe this work would resonate strongly with your gallery's mission and would welcome the opportunity to discuss a potential exhibition." Attached to the draft email were 15 photographs, all images of Marcus's subjects, taken during his sessions, but presented as Natalie's original work. She was preparing to expand her deception beyond Portland, using his portfolio to gain access to even more prestigious venues. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was a document titled Career Development Plan 2024-2027, saved in her Google Drive. The file outlined a 3-year strategy for establishing herself as a leading documentary photographer, with Unseen Voices positioned as her breakthrough project. The plan included specific goals: solo exhibitions in 5 major cities, feature articles in 3 national photography magazines, and representation by a top-tier photography agent. Each milestone was mapped out with concrete steps and timelines, showing a level of strategic thinking that went far beyond opportunistic credit stealing. Most disturbing was a section titled Transition Strategy that outlined how to gradually separate her work from Marcus's involvement. The plan described establishing independent relationships with subjects, developing distinct artistic voice, and positioning collaborative phase as mentorship experience. She'd been planning to systematically erase him from his own project, transforming their relationship from partnership to mentorship to complete independence. Marcus realized he'd been living with someone who'd been methodically destroying his artistic identity while pretending to support it. The final section of the document included financial projections based on print sales, licensing deals, and exhibition fees. Natalie had calculated that the Unseen Voices project could generate over $200,000 in revenue over 3 years, assuming successful gallery representation and media coverage. Marcus closed the laptop, feeling physically sick. He'd been sharing his life with someone who'd been cold-bloodedly planning to steal his work, his subjects, his artistic vision, and his professional future. Every supportive gesture, every helpful suggestion, every moment of apparent partnership had been calculated moves in a long-term strategy to appropriate his creative identity. The woman he'd trusted with his deepest artistic ambitions, the person he'd considered proposing to, had been systematically betraying him for months while sleeping beside him every night. As Marcus sat in their apartment, surrounded by evidence of the most intimate betrayal he'd ever experienced, he realized that confronting Natalie wouldn't be enough. She built too elaborate a deception, involved too many other people, and progressed too far toward her goals. He needed to act decisively to reclaim his work and expose the truth. But first, he needed to document everything he'd discovered and prepare for the battle of his professional life. Because in 4 months, if he didn't stop her, Natalie would be standing in the Cascade Contemporary Gallery, accepting praise and recognition for the work that had consumed the last 2 years of his life. And based on everything he'd uncovered, she was prepared to fight viciously to keep what she'd stolen. Marcus spent the next 3 days preparing for the confrontation that would determine the future of his artistic career. He printed every email, organized every screenshot, and compiled a comprehensive timeline that documented Natalie's deception with irrefutable precision. But more importantly, he consulted with 2 attorneys who specialized in intellectual property theft. The first lawyer, Patricia Chen, confirmed Marcus's worst fears. While he owned the copyright to his photographs, proving theft of artistic concept and professional identity would be complex and expensive. The second attorney, Robert Kim, offered a more pragmatic approach focused on immediate damage control rather than lengthy litigation. Your priority should be stopping the September exhibition, Robert advised during their consultation. If she successfully presents your work as her own in a major gallery, the professional damage will be exponential and much harder to undo. Marcus also reached out to James Clearwater, Elena Vasquez, and 3 other subjects from his portfolio. He needed to understand exactly what Natalie had told them, and whether they knew they were being used in what amounted to artistic fraud. James's reaction was immediate and angry. "She told me she was continuing your project with your blessing," he said during their phone call. "She said you were focusing on other work and had asked her to maintain relationships with the people you'd photographed. I never would have agreed to additional sessions if I'd known she was lying." Elena's response was equally troubling. "Natalie said she was the one who originally found me for the project, and that you were her assistant who handled the technical photography. I was confused because I remembered it differently, but she seemed so certain. The realization that Natalie had been manipulating his subjects, rewriting their memories of their interactions, added another layer of violation to her betrayal. These weren't just photographs being stolen. They were relationships built on trust that she'd corrupted for her own purposes. On Thursday evening, Marcus set up a small recording device in their living room and waited for Natalie to return from work. He'd decided to give her one opportunity to explain her actions before taking more aggressive steps to protect his career. Natalie arrived at 7:30, carrying takeout containers and chatting cheerfully about her day. She seemed completely relaxed, showing no signs of guilt or anxiety about her secret activities. Marcus watched her move through their shared space, marveling at how completely she'd compartmentalized her deception. "I need to talk to you about something serious," Marcus said as she unpacked dinner. "Sure, what's up?" she replied, not looking up from the food containers. "I know about the Behance portfolio. I know about the emails to Catherine Morrison. I know about the September exhibition." Natalie's hands froze over the takeout containers. For several seconds, she didn't move or speak. When she finally looked up, her expression had transformed from casual friendliness to something Marcus had never seen before: cold calculation mixed with trapped animal panic. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Marcus opened his laptop and turned the screen toward her, displaying the email thread with Catherine Morrison about her solo exhibition. "I found everything, Natalie. The website domains, the professional listings, the emails to my subjects. I know you've been planning this for months." Natalie stared at the screen, her face cycling through several expressions before settling on defiant anger. "You went through my private emails? That's a complete violation of privacy, Marcus." "Privacy?" Marcus's voice rose despite his intention to stay calm. "You've been stealing my work, my subjects, my professional identity, and you're concerned about privacy?" "I haven't stolen anything," Natalie snapped, closing his laptop with more force than necessary. "Those are my photographs, taken with my camera, developed using my artistic vision." "Your artistic vision?" "Natalie, you were present during my sessions because you were my girlfriend, not because you were collaborating as an artist. You never told me you were taking your own photographs." "I didn't tell you because I knew you'd react exactly like this," she said, standing up and beginning to pace around their small living room. "You're possessive about your work and wouldn't have been able to handle sharing creative space." The accusation was so outrageous that Marcus momentarily couldn't respond. She was reframing her deception as protecting his feelings, transforming herself from perpetrator to victim. "Sharing creative space?" he finally managed. "Natalie, you've been presenting my project as your own work. You're planning a solo exhibition, using photographs of subjects I found, relationships I built, and concepts I developed." "Our concepts," she corrected. "Do you think those artist statements wrote themselves? Do you think the presentation strategy just materialized? I've been an equal partner in this project from the beginning, even if you were too self-absorbed to acknowledge it." Marcus felt like he was talking to a stranger, the woman who'd supported his career, who'd seemed genuinely proud of his artistic achievements, was now claiming co-ownership of work she'd secretly been appropriating. "Equal partner?" Marcus pulled out his phone and began reading from his notes. "James Clearwater told me you said I was your assistant who handled technical photography. Elena Vasquez said you claimed to be the one who originally found her. How exactly does that sound like equal partnership?" Natalie's expression flickered briefly, but she recovered quickly. "I may have simplified the explanation for some of the subjects. People don't need to understand every detail of our working relationship." "Simplified the explanation? You completely erased my role and made yourself the primary artist. That's not simplification, Natalie. That's fraud." "Fraud?" Her voice rose to match his. "I've put just as much work into this project as you have. I've been present for every session, contributed to every artistic decision, and handled all the professional presentations. If anything, you should be thanking me for elevating your work beyond what you could have achieved alone." The audacity of her response left Marcus speechless. She'd not only stolen his work, but convinced herself that she'd improved it, that he should be grateful for her theft. "You've been lying to me for months," Marcus said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "You've been building a parallel career using my work while pretending to support my artistic development? How can you possibly justify that?" "I've been protecting us both," Natalie shot back. "You're talented, Marcus, but you're naive about the business side of art. You would have fumbled these gallery opportunities and wasted the potential of this project. I've been ensuring that Unseen Voices gets the recognition it deserves." "The recognition you deserve, you mean?" "The recognition we both deserve." She stopped pacing and faced him directly. "But if you can't handle sharing credit for collaborative work, then maybe we need to separate our professional interests." Marcus stared at her, amazed by her ability to reframe the situation. She was now presenting his objection to her theft as evidence of his inability to collaborate, making herself sound reasonable while portraying him as selfish. "There was no collaboration, Natalie. You took photographs of my subjects during my sessions without telling me, then built a secret career around presenting that work as your own vision. My camera, my artistic eye, my photographs," she replied coldly. "The fact that we were documenting the same subjects doesn't make your work more valid than mine. But you used my research, my contacts, my relationships with these people. You couldn't have created any of those photographs without access I provided. And you couldn't have presented the work professionally without my marketing expertise and industry connections. We both contributed essential elements." Marcus realized that arguing about the nature of collaboration was pointless. Natalie had constructed an elaborate justification for her actions and wasn't going to admit wrongdoing no matter what evidence he presented. "Regardless of how you rationalize this," he said, "I can't allow you to proceed with the September exhibition. You're presenting my work as your solo project, and that's professionally damaging to me." Natalie's expression hardened. "You can't stop me, Marcus. Those are my photographs, created with my equipment, showcasing subjects I developed relationships with independently. You have no legal claim to prevent me from exhibiting my own work." "Independent relationships? I have emails where you told Catherine Morrison that you developed the conceptual framework over 2 years. I have documentation showing you've been systematically building a false professional history." "Prove it," she challenged. "Prove that my artistic vision isn't equally valid. Prove that my photographs aren't as accomplished as yours. Prove that my relationships with these subjects aren't genuine." Marcus realized she was daring him to take legal action, betting that he wouldn't be willing or able to follow through with expensive litigation. She'd calculated that he would back down rather than fight publicly. "I've already consulted with attorneys," Marcus said quietly. "I know exactly what my options are." For the first time since the conversation began, Natalie looked genuinely worried. "You're bluffing. You don't have money for lawyers. I have enough to stop you from destroying my career." They stared at each other across their living room, the space that had once felt like a shared home now charged with hostility and betrayal. Marcus could see Natalie calculating, trying to determine whether he was serious about legal action. "Fine," she said finally. "If that's how you want to handle this, then we'll handle it professionally rather than personally." "What does that mean?" "It means I'm moving out. It means we're ending our relationship. And it means you'll be dealing with my attorney rather than with me directly." The casual way she announced the end of their 3-year relationship, as if it were a business decision rather than the dissolution of what Marcus had thought was love, highlighted just how completely he'd misjudged her character. "You're willing to destroy our relationship to steal my work?" he asked. "I'm not stealing anything, and you're the one making this personal instead of professional. I offered to share credit, to acknowledge our collaboration, but you're too egotistical to accept that other people contributed to your success." The rewrite was masterful. In her version, she was the reasonable party offering compromise while he was the stubborn artist too proud to share recognition. She'd transformed their entire relationship history into a narrative that supported her claims. "When are you moving out?" Marcus asked, realizing that argument was futile. "This weekend. I'll need you to be elsewhere while I pack my things." "And the exhibition?" "Proceeds as planned. My attorney will contact you if you decide to pursue legal action, but I doubt you'll follow through. This conversation proves you're more interested in drama than in protecting your actual interests." With that, Natalie walked into their bedroom and closed the door. Marcus sat alone in the living room, surrounded by the takeout containers she'd abandoned, trying to process what had just happened. In the span of 30 minutes, he'd lost his girlfriend, his shared living space, and apparently his control over work that represented 2 years of his artistic life. Natalie had not only refused to admit wrongdoing, but had managed to make him feel like the unreasonable party in their dispute. But as Marcus replayed the conversation, he realized something important. Natalie's defensiveness and immediate escalation to legal threats suggested she knew her position was vulnerable. Her willingness to end their relationship rather than address his concerns indicated she was more worried about exposure than she'd admitted. Marcus spent that night researching his options with new determination. If Natalie wanted to handle this professionally rather than personally, he would make sure she understood exactly what professional consequences her actions would bring. The battle for his artistic identity was just beginning. But for the first time since discovering her deception, Marcus felt like he had a chance to win. The first week after Natalie moved out was strangely liberating. Marcus had expected to feel devastated by the end of their relationship, but instead he felt clear-headed for the first time in months. Without her constant presence, he could finally see how much mental energy he'd been unconsciously dedicating to managing her moods and maintaining the fiction of their partnership. But the professional situation was rapidly escalating beyond their personal dispute. On Tuesday morning, Marcus received a cease and desist letter from Natalie's attorney, demanding that he stop harassing her subjects and threatening legal action if he continued to interfere with her artistic practice. The letter was professionally crafted psychological warfare. It positioned Marcus as a vindictive ex-boyfriend trying to sabotage his former partner's legitimate career, rather than an artist protecting his stolen work. More concerning, it demonstrated that Natalie had retained expensive legal representation, suggesting she was prepared for a prolonged fight. Marcus forwarded the letter to Robert Kim, his attorney, who scheduled an emergency meeting for that afternoon. When they met at Robert's downtown office, the lawyer's expression was grimmer than Marcus had expected. "This is more sophisticated than typical intellectual property disputes," Robert explained, reviewing the cease and desist letter. "Her attorney is using harassment and stalking language, which shifts the focus from copyright issues to personal conduct. They're trying to make you the aggressor." "But I haven't harassed anyone," Marcus protested. "I called my own subjects to verify what she'd told them." "Legally, you're correct, but perception matters in these cases. If they can paint you as an unstable ex-boyfriend rather than a legitimate artist protecting his work, judges and gallery owners will be more sympathetic to her position." Robert outlined the challenges ahead. Proving artistic theft required demonstrating that Natalie's work was substantially similar to Marcus's original vision, that she'd used his research and connections improperly, and that her actions constituted intentional misrepresentation. Each element would require expensive documentation and expert testimony. "What about the emails I found?" Marcus asked. "Doesn't her correspondence with galleries prove she's misrepresenting the work?" "It's evidence, but she can argue those emails reflect her genuine belief about her contributions to the project. Unless we can prove deliberate fraud, she has plausible deniability." The legal consultation left Marcus feeling overwhelmed by the complexity and cost of protecting his artistic identity through the courts. Robert estimated that comprehensive litigation could cost $50,000 or more, with no guarantee of success. But that afternoon brought an unexpected development. Catherine Morrison from the Cascade Contemporary Gallery called Marcus directly, her voice tense with professional concern. "Marcus, I need to speak with you about some discrepancies I've discovered regarding the September exhibition," she said. "Could you come to Portland this week?" The urgency in Catherine's voice suggested that Natalie's deception was beginning to unravel independently of Marcus's efforts. He agreed to drive to Portland the following day. When Marcus arrived at the Cascade Contemporary Gallery, Catherine led him to her private office, where she'd spread out printed emails and exhibition materials across her desk. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Marcus could sense underlying anger. "I've been corresponding with Natalie Brooks about her upcoming solo exhibition," Catherine began, "but I've received some confusing information that I need to clarify." She handed Marcus a printed email from James Clearwater, dated 2 days earlier. James had written directly to the gallery after learning about the September exhibition through Natalie's outreach. "Dear Ms. Morrison," the email read, "I was surprised to learn that Natalie Brooks is presenting my portrait in a solo exhibition. When Marcus Chen originally photographed me for his Unseen Voices project, I understood that Ms. Brooks was his girlfriend, who sometimes accompanied him to sessions. I never consented to be part of her independent project, and I'm concerned about how my image and story are being used." Catherine had received similar emails from Elena Vasquez and 2 other subjects, all expressing confusion about Natalie's claimed relationship with them and her right to exhibit their photographs. "This is very troubling," Catherine continued. "When artists misrepresent their relationships with subjects, it raises serious ethical and legal concerns for galleries. I need to understand exactly what happened during your collaborative work with Ms. Brooks." Marcus realized this was his opportunity to present the truth without appearing vindictive. He methodically explained the history of his Unseen Voices project, his relationship with each subject, and his discovery of Natalie's parallel portfolio and secret correspondence. Catherine listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes. When Marcus finished, she was quiet for several minutes, reviewing the materials on her desk. "This is unprecedented in my experience," she finally said. "I've dealt with attribution disputes, but never a case where one artist systematically appropriated another's subjects and relationships while misrepresenting the collaborative nature of their work." She showed Marcus the formal exhibition proposal Natalie had submitted, which described Unseen Voices as her personal documentary project developed over 2 years of independent work. The proposal made no mention of Marcus beyond a brief reference to technical collaboration in the early phases. "Based on what you've told me and the concerns raised by your subjects, I have serious doubts about proceeding with this exhibition," Catherine said. "However, I need to speak with Ms. Brooks directly before making a final decision." Marcus left Portland feeling cautiously optimistic. The subjects themselves were contradicting Natalie's claims, and Catherine seemed genuinely troubled by the ethical implications of the situation. But he knew Natalie would fight aggressively to preserve the exhibition that represented her breakthrough into the professional art world. That prediction proved accurate within hours. Marcus's phone began ringing at 8 p.m. with calls from a number he didn't recognize. When he finally answered, Natalie's voice was shaking with rage. "You've been sabotaging me," she accused. "You contacted Catherine Morrison and poisoned her against my work." "I responded to her inquiry about discrepancies she'd already discovered," Marcus replied calmly. "Your subjects contacted the gallery independently." "My subjects?" Natalie's voice rose to near shouting. "Those people agreed to work with me. They understood that I was developing my own artistic vision based on our collaborative sessions. Collaborative sessions that you attended as my girlfriend, not as an independent artist. I was never just your girlfriend at those sessions. I was contributing creatively from the beginning, even if you were too self-absorbed to recognize it." Marcus realized that Natalie had convinced herself her revised history was true. She genuinely seemed to believe that she'd been an equal creative partner from the start, despite all evidence to the contrary. Regardless of your perspective, Marcus said, the subjects themselves are saying they never consented to be part of your independent project. They're confused by your manipulation. You've been telling them lies about our working relationship. The conversation continued in circles, with Natalie alternating between accusations and attempts to negotiate some form of shared exhibition. But Marcus could hear desperation creeping into her voice. The gallery's investigation had clearly shaken her confidence. 2 days later, Catherine Morrison called with news that Marcus had barely dared to hope for. "I've decided to cancel Ms. Brooks' September exhibition," she announced. "After speaking with her directly and reviewing additional documentation, I'm not satisfied that she has clear rights to present this work as her independent project." Marcus felt a surge of relief so intense it was almost physically overwhelming. "What did she say when you told her?" "She threatened legal action, claimed I was discriminating against her based on your personal relationship, and accused me of failing to understand collaborative artistic practice. But ultimately, the concerns raised by your subjects were too significant to ignore." Catherine explained that galleries had strict ethical obligations regarding artist-subject relationships and consent. When multiple subjects questioned an artist's right to exhibit their images, responsible galleries had to err on the side of caution. "This doesn't resolve the broader dispute between you and Ms. Brooks," Catherine continued, "but it does protect my gallery from potential liability and ensures that these subjects' rights are respected." Marcus thanked Catherine profusely, understanding that her decision represented professional vindication of his position. A respected gallery director had independently concluded that Natalie's claims were insufficient to justify exhibiting disputed work, but Natalie's response to the cancellation was swift and vindictive. Within 24 hours, Marcus discovered that she'd filed complaints against him with 2 professional photography organizations, alleging harassment and interference with her artistic practice. She'd also launched a social media campaign presenting herself as a victim of gender discrimination in the art world. Her Instagram account, which had previously featured lifestyle content, transformed into a platform for denouncing male artists who can't handle women's creative independence. She posted carefully cropped versions of her disputed photographs, alongside captions describing the challenges faced by collaborative female artists trying to establish their own identity. The posts were strategically crafted to generate sympathy, without providing enough context for viewers to understand the underlying dispute. Natalie presented herself as an emerging artist whose work was being suppressed by a jealous ex-partner, tapping into broader conversations about women's representation in the art world. Several photography blogs picked up her story, framing it as an example of male gatekeeping in documentary photography. The coverage was limited but enough to create confusion about the facts of the case. Marcus found himself being portrayed as someone trying to silence a woman's artistic voice rather than protecting his own stolen work. The social media campaign was psychologically devastating. Marcus watched strangers online defending Natalie's right to artistic expression while condemning his possessiveness over collaborative work. The truth was more complex than social media allowed, but complexity didn't generate engagement the way simple narratives about victimization did. Derek Martinez helped Marcus track the spread of Natalie's narrative across various platforms. The campaign was sophisticated, using hashtags and keywords that connected to broader discussions about art world inequities. She was leveraging legitimate social justice concerns to shield herself from accountability for her deception. "This is professional reputation management," Derek explained as they reviewed the analytics. "She's not trying to win legal battles. She's trying to control public perception so that questioning her becomes socially unacceptable." The strategy was working. Several online photography communities began discussing Marcus's case as an example of male artists trying to control female creativity. The fact that he'd discovered his work being stolen was reframed as evidence of his inability to accept women as equal collaborators. Marcus realized that winning the legal and professional battles wasn't enough if Natalie successfully convinced the broader photography community that he was the aggressor. Her social media narrative threatened to damage his reputation regardless of the facts. But then James Clearwater made a decision that changed everything. Frustrated by seeing his image used in Natalie's social media posts without permission, he created his own Instagram account and posted a detailed video explaining his actual relationship with both photographers. "I want to set the record straight," James said in the video, speaking directly to the camera. "Marcus Chen spent 3 days with me, learning about my work and my community before taking any photographs. He showed respect for our traditions and asked permission for everything. Natalie Brooks was there as his girlfriend, but she never introduced herself as a photographer or asked for my consent to take her own pictures." The video went viral within the documentary photography community. James's calm, authoritative explanation of the facts provided exactly the kind of credible testimony that Marcus couldn't offer himself without seeming defensive. Elena Vasquez followed with her own social media post, describing how Natalie had misrepresented her relationship with Marcus and claimed credit for finding Elena as a subject. Other people from the Unseen Voices project began sharing their own experiences, creating a chorus of voices that contradicted Natalie's narrative. The tide of online opinion began shifting as the subjects themselves spoke out against being used in a dispute they hadn't consented to join. Natalie's social media campaign backfired as the very people she'd claimed to represent publicly rejected her version of events. Within a week, Natalie deleted her Instagram account and stopped posting about the case entirely. The professional photography organizations quietly dropped their investigations after receiving testimony from Marcus's subjects. The blogs that had covered her story published follow-up pieces acknowledging the complexity of the situation. Marcus had survived the immediate crisis, but the experience had fundamentally changed his understanding of artistic collaboration, professional relationships, and the vulnerability that came with trusting the wrong person. He'd learned that protecting creative work required vigilance not just against strangers, but against those closest to you. As he sat in his apartment, finally free from Natalie's influence but scarred by months of betrayal and conflict, Marcus began planning how to rebuild his career on a foundation of complete transparency and independence. The battle was over, but the real work of recovery was just beginning. The psychological aftermath of the ordeal proved more challenging than Marcus had anticipated. For weeks after Natalie's social media campaign collapsed, he found himself second-guessing every professional interaction, wondering if other people in his life harbored hidden agendas. The paranoia was exhausting, but it felt necessary after discovering how thoroughly he'd been deceived by someone he'd trusted completely. Sleep became elusive. Marcus would lie awake replaying conversations with Natalie, searching for clues he'd missed, moments when he should have recognized her deception. The realization that she'd been methodically manipulating him for months while sharing his bed, his meals, his most vulnerable artistic moments, left him questioning his ability to judge character entirely. But gradually, unexpected support began emerging from professional quarters. Word of the dispute had spread through photography circles, and while some people remained neutral, many established artists reached out privately to share their own stories of artistic theft and professional betrayal. Margaret Wong, a documentary photographer whose work Marcus had long admired, sent a particularly meaningful email. "What happened to you isn't uncommon, unfortunately. The art world has always attracted people who mistake proximity to creativity for creative ability themselves. The fact that your subjects spoke up proves the integrity of your original work." These messages helped Marcus understand that his experience, while personally devastating, represented a broader pattern in creative industries. Ambitious individuals without genuine artistic vision often attempted to appropriate others' work through strategic positioning and gradual narrative revision. The Photography community's response also revealed how sophisticated modern artistic theft had become. Traditional copyright law focused on literal reproduction of images, but Natalie's approach, stealing concepts, relationships, and professional identity while creating technically different photographs, represented a new form of intellectual property violation that legal systems hadn't fully adapted to address. 3 weeks after the exhibition cancellation, Marcus received an unexpected phone call from Maria Santos, the director of the Seattle Center for Documentary Arts. She'd followed the public aspects of his dispute with Natalie and wanted to discuss a potential opportunity. "We're organizing a group exhibition about artistic integrity and the ethics of documentary photography," Maria explained during their meeting at the center's downtown office. "Your case raises important questions about consent, collaboration, and the responsibilities artists have toward their subjects." The proposed exhibition, titled Voices and Choices, would explore how documentary photographers navigate relationships with the communities they photograph. Marcus's experience with Natalie had highlighted the vulnerability of subjects who trusted artists to represent them respectfully, only to discover their images being used in ways they hadn't approved. "We'd like to feature your original Unseen Voices work alongside statements from your subjects about their experience being misrepresented," Maria continued. "It would give them agency in telling their own story while showcasing the ethical approach to documentary work." The opportunity excited Marcus, but it also presented new challenges. Several of his subjects had expressed frustration about being dragged into his dispute with Natalie, and he didn't want to exploit their situation further for his own professional benefit. James Clearwater's response when Marcus called to discuss the exhibition surprised him with its enthusiasm. "This could prevent other photographers from treating people the way she treated us," James said. "If sharing our experience helps other communities protect themselves, then it's worth doing." Elena Vasquez agreed, but with conditions. "I want to write my own statement about what happened," she insisted. "No more having other people speak for me or put words in my mouth." The collaborative process of developing the exhibition became therapeutic for Marcus. Working directly with his subjects to craft their own narratives about the experience gave them agency they'd lost when Natalie appropriated their images. It also demonstrated the kind of transparent, consensual artistic practice that Marcus wanted to define his future work. But the emotional healing was complicated by practical concerns about his financial situation. The months spent fighting Natalie's theft had prevented Marcus from pursuing paid photography work, and his savings were nearly depleted by legal fees and the cost of preparing exhibition materials. Wedding photography, which had been his primary income source, felt hollow after the intensity of documentary work. Standing behind couples during their happiest moments, Marcus found himself distracted by thoughts about authenticity, manipulation, and the stories people constructed about their own lives. The disconnect was troubling. Photography had always been Marcus's refuge, the activity that made sense of the world's complexity through visual clarity. But Natalie's betrayal had contaminated his relationship with his own artistic practice, making him question the authenticity of every image he created. Recovery required deliberately rebuilding his connection to photography's fundamental purpose. Marcus began taking long walks through Seattle neighborhoods he'd never explored, carrying only a basic film camera and no agenda beyond observation. The simple act of seeing without performing, of creating images purely for personal expression rather than professional advancement, gradually restored his confidence. During one of these walks, in the Beacon Hill neighborhood, Marcus encountered an elderly Vietnamese man tending an elaborate garden squeezed between two apartment buildings. The man, Duc Nguyen, had transformed a narrow strip of unused land into a stunning display of vegetables and flowers that drew neighbors from blocks away. Their conversation, conducted in a mixture of English and gestures, reminded Marcus why he'd become drawn to documentary photography in the first place. Duc's story, fleeing Vietnam as a refugee, working multiple jobs to support his family, creating beauty in unexpected urban spaces, embodied the resilience and dignity that Marcus sought to capture through his art. But this time, Marcus approached the interaction differently. Instead of immediately thinking about photographic possibilities, he spent 3 visits simply getting to know Duke, learning about his gardening techniques and his memories of Vietnam. Only after establishing genuine friendship did Marcus mention his photography, and only with Duke's enthusiastic permission did he begin creating images. The photographs that emerged from their collaboration felt different from anything Marcus had created before. They captured not just Duke's relationship to his garden, but the trust and mutual respect that had developed between photographer and subject. The images had an intimacy and authenticity that Marcus's earlier work, despite its technical proficiency, had sometimes lacked. Working with Duke also revealed how Natalie's presence during his original Unseen Voices sessions had subtly altered the dynamic. Even when she'd remained in the background, her presence had introduced an element of performance, a sense that the interactions were being observed and evaluated rather than simply experienced. The realization wasn't entirely negative. Marcus understood that all photography involved performance to some degree. Subjects inevitably adjusted their behavior when cameras were present. But Natalie's secret agenda had introduced deception into relationships that required absolute trust to succeed. As Marcus developed the film from his sessions with Duke, he felt his confidence returning. These new photographs demonstrated that his artistic vision remained intact despite Natalie's attempts to appropriate it. His ability to connect with subjects, to find beauty in overlooked places, to tell stories through visual means, none of that had been dependent on her contributions. The Seattle Center exhibition opened in November, 6 months after Marcus had discovered Natalie's deception. The response exceeded everyone's expectations, drawing audiences who were interested not just in documentary photography, but in broader questions about artistic ethics and community consent. James Clearwater attended the opening, bringing several family members who viewed his portraits with obvious pride. "This is how it should be," he told Marcus as they stood before the wall displaying his image. "The person in the photograph should have a voice in how their story gets told." Elena Vasquez's written statement, displayed beside her portrait, powerfully described her experience of being misrepresented. "When someone uses your image without your permission, they steal part of your story. They take your truth and make it serve their purposes instead of yours." The exhibition generated significant media coverage that helped restore Marcus's professional reputation. But more importantly, it established him as an advocate for ethical documentary practice, opening doors to teaching opportunities and collaborative projects that aligned with his evolving artistic philosophy. A month after the exhibition opening, Marcus received a package with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter from Natalie, the first direct communication they'd had since she'd moved out of their apartment. "Marcus," the letter began, "I've been doing a lot of thinking about what happened between us, and I want you to know that I'm sorry for how things ended. I never intended for our professional disagreement to become so personal and destructive." The letter continued for 2 pages, but its tone never shifted toward genuine accountability. Natalie described their conflict as a misunderstanding about collaborative work and portrayed her secret activities as parallel artistic development rather than theft. She seemed genuinely unable to acknowledge the deception and manipulation that had defined her behavior. "I hope someday we can both look back on this as a learning experience that made us better artists," the letter concluded. "I wish you success with your future work." Marcus read the letter twice, then filed it with the other documentation from their dispute. Natalie's inability to accept responsibility confirmed that ending their relationship had been necessary for his artistic and personal integrity. But the letter also prompted reflection on his own growth during the months since their confrontation. The experience had taught him valuable lessons about protecting his work, vetting collaborators, and maintaining clear boundaries in professional relationships. More importantly, it had forced him to clarify his own values and artistic priorities. 6 months later, Marcus was working on a new documentary project about urban agriculture in immigrant communities, a natural extension of his friendship with Duc Nguyen. The work was proceeding slowly but satisfyingly, with extensive community input and transparent collaboration at every stage. He'd also begun teaching workshops on documentary ethics at local photography schools, sharing his experience to help emerging artists avoid similar exploitation. The teaching work was rewarding in ways that purely commercial photography had never been, allowing Marcus to contribute to the broader profession's ethical development. The apartment he'd once shared with Natalie had been transformed into a working studio, with equipment organized for efficiency rather than aesthetics. The space felt entirely his own now, free from the subtle compromises and accommodations that had characterized their shared living situation. Looking back, Marcus could see that Natalie's betrayal, while devastating at the time, had ultimately strengthened his artistic practice and professional integrity. The experience had forced him to confront uncomfortable questions about authenticity, collaboration, and the power dynamics inherent in documentary photography. He'd learned that protecting creative work required not just legal knowledge, but psychological awareness. The ability to recognize when someone's interest in your success might mask their own ambitions. More importantly, he'd discovered that true artistic partnership required transparency and mutual respect, rather than hidden agendas and gradual appropriation. As Marcus prepared to sleep in his reclaimed apartment, surrounded by prints from his new work and planning materials for upcoming projects, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: complete confidence in his artistic direction and personal choices. The battle with Natalie was over, but its lessons would inform every aspect of his creative life going forward. And for the first time since discovering her deception, Marcus looked toward the future with genuine excitement rather than cautious anxiety. 1 year after the gallery confrontation that changed everything, Marcus stood before a packed auditorium at the Pacific Northwest Photography Symposium, preparing to deliver the keynote address that would define his evolution from victim to advocate. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was about to speak to an audience of 300 photographers about artistic integrity at the very conference where Natalie had planned to present herself as an emerging documentary artist. The symposium organizers had reached out 6 months earlier after reading about his experience in American Photo magazine. The article, titled "When Collaboration Becomes Theft," had sparked widespread discussion about the blurred lines between artistic partnership and exploitation in the digital age. "Photography has always been about trust," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Trust between the artist and subject, trust between collaborators, and ultimately, trust between the photographer and the audience, who believes in the authenticity of what they're seeing. In the front row, he spotted familiar faces. James Clearwater had driven up from the reservation. Elena Vasquez sat beside her grown daughter, and Duc Nguyen wore his best suit for the occasion. Their presence reminded Marcus that this speech wasn't just about his professional recovery, but about honoring the people whose stories had been caught in the crossfire of artistic theft. "A year ago, I discovered that someone I loved and trusted had been systematically appropriating my work, my subjects, and my artistic identity," Marcus continued. But the real violation wasn't the stolen photographs. It was the betrayal of the relationships I'd built with the communities I documented. The audience was completely silent, many leaning forward in their seats. In an industry where competition was fierce and recognition scarce, Marcus's story resonated with photographers who'd experienced their own struggles with attribution, collaboration gone wrong, and the vulnerability that came with sharing creative work. Marcus described the meticulous process Natalie had used to gradually reposition herself from supportive partner to collaborative, equal to primary artist. He explained how she'd exploited his trust, his subjects' consent, and the gallery system's reliance on artist representations to build a false professional identity. The sophistication of modern artistic theft extends far beyond simple copyright violation, he explained. In the digital age, someone can steal your artistic vision, your professional relationships, and your reputation while never technically reproducing a single image you've created. But the heart of his presentation focused on the lessons learned through recovery and the new approaches to documentary work that had emerged from the crisis. Marcus shared his updated consent protocols, which required written agreements not just with primary subjects but with anyone who might appear in background shots. He described his practice of providing subjects with contact sheets from their sessions, ensuring they understood exactly how their images might be used. Ethical documentary work requires ongoing dialogue, Marcus emphasized. It's not enough to get permission once. We need to maintain relationships with our subjects to ensure they remain comfortable with how their stories are being told as our work evolves. The presentation included a powerful segment featuring video messages from his subjects. James Clearwater spoke about the importance of photographers understanding the cultural context of the communities they document. Elena Vasquez discussed the difference between being photographed by someone who saw her as a person versus someone who viewed her as content for professional advancement. Marcus took time to learn my story before taking my picture, Elena's video statement explained. The other photographer saw me as an opportunity. That difference shows in the final images, but more importantly, it shows in how those images are presented to the world. During the question and answer session, a young photographer raised her hand nervously. How do you trust anyone now? How do you know when collaboration is genuine versus someone trying to take advantage? Marcus paused, considering the question that had haunted him for months. You start with radical transparency, he replied. You document everything. You clarify expectations explicitly, and you trust your instincts when something feels wrong. But most importantly, you remember that healthy collaboration enhances everyone involved. It doesn't require anyone to diminish their own contribution to elevate someone else's. Another photographer asked about the legal aspects of protecting artistic work. Marcus introduced Robert Kim, his attorney, who'd prepared a presentation about intellectual property rights in collaborative artistic practice. Robert's segment provided practical advice about documentation, contracts, and the legal remedies available when artistic theft occurred. But the most powerful moment came when a photographer in the back row stood up and shared her own story of having work appropriated by a mentor who'd gradually claimed credit for her innovations. Her voice shook as she described feeling gaslit and isolated, believing she was imagining the theft because it happened so gradually. Hearing your story made me realize I wasn't crazy, she told Marcus. Someone else had experienced exactly what I went through, and you found a way to fight back effectively. The response emboldened others in the audience to share similar experiences. Over the next 30 minutes, Marcus listened to story after story of artistic theft, career sabotage, and professional manipulation. The breadth of experiences revealed that his situation with Natalie represented just one example of much broader patterns in creative industries. As the session concluded, Marcus felt the profound satisfaction of having transformed his personal trauma into a resource for other artists. The symposium organizers later told him it was the most engaged audience they'd ever hosted, with photographers staying afterward to continue discussions and share contact information for ongoing support. But the real validation came during the reception that evening. Marcus was approached by Dr. Sarah Chen, the director of the Visual Arts Ethics Institute at Stanford University. She'd been following his case and wanted to discuss a research collaboration. Your experience highlights gaps in how we teach professional ethics to emerging artists, Dr. Chen explained. We're developing a curriculum for graduate photography programs, and we'd like you to help design case studies that prepare students for these complex situations. The invitation to contribute to academic research represented the kind of professional recognition Marcus had always hoped for, but achieved through an entirely different path than he'd expected. Instead of gaining attention purely through his artistic work, He was being recognized as a thought leader on ethical practice. 6 months later, Marcus published his first academic paper, co-authored with Dr. Chen, titled Trust and Appropriation, in Contemporary Documentary Photography. The paper analyzed his case alongside similar incidents, identifying patterns in how artistic theft occurred and recommending systematic changes to protect both artists and subjects. The research work complemented his evolving photography practice, which had become more collaborative and community-centered than ever before. His new project, Growing Together, documented urban agriculture initiatives in immigrant communities throughout the Pacific Northwest. But unlike his earlier work, this project was developed in partnership with community organizations from the beginning. Every photograph tells a story about power, Marcus explained to the graduate students in his ethics seminar at the University of Washington. The question is whether that power serves the subject, the photographer, or some external agenda. His teaching had become as important to him as his artistic practice. Working with emerging photographers, Marcus could share hard-won wisdom about navigating professional relationships, protecting creative work, and maintaining ethical standards in competitive environments. One particularly bright student, Angela Rodriguez, reminded Marcus of his younger self, idealistic, talented, but naive about the business aspects of artistic careers. During office hours, she confided her concerns about a mentor who seemed increasingly interested in claiming credit for her innovative approaches to street photography. "Trust your instincts," Marcus advised, sharing documentation strategies and warning signs he'd learned to recognize. Legitimate mentorship elevates your work without diminishing your individual contribution. 6 months later, Angela sent him a grateful email explaining how his advice had helped her recognize and address appropriation attempts before they escalated. The email reinforced Marcus's belief that his painful experience with Natalie had been transformed into something valuable for the broader artistic community. Meanwhile, his personal life had stabilized in ways he hadn't expected. The trauma of Natalie's betrayal had initially made him wary of romantic relationships, but gradually he'd learned to distinguish between healthy vulnerability and dangerous naivety. He'd been dating Lisa Park, a museum curator, for 8 months. Their relationship was built on the kind of transparency Marcus now insisted upon in all his partnerships. Lisa knew his complete history with Natalie, understood his heightened sensitivity to professional boundary issues, and supported his advocacy work without trying to control or redirect it. "You've become someone who protects other people's creativity," Lisa observed during one of their weekend walks through Seattle's Sculpture Park. "That's a beautiful thing to build from such a painful experience." The comment prompted Marcus to reflect on how completely his identity had evolved. Before Natalie's betrayal, he'd been primarily focused on his own artistic advancement, measuring success through gallery representation and critical recognition. Now his satisfaction came largely from preventing other artists from experiencing similar exploitation. But the most profound transformation was in his relationship with his own subjects. The experience of having his work appropriated had given Marcus deeper empathy for the vulnerability that people felt when entrusting their stories to documentary photographers. During a recent session with Maria Santos, an elderly woman documenting the history of her neighborhood's transformation, Marcus found himself thinking about Elena Vasquez and the violation she'd felt when Natalie misrepresented their relationship. "I want to make sure you feel completely comfortable with how I present your photographs," Marcus told Maria as they reviewed contact sheets together. "Your story belongs to you first, and to my project second." This approach took longer and required more emotional investment than his earlier documentary methods, but it produced work that felt more authentic and ethically sound. Subjects became collaborators in the truest sense, maintaining agency over their representation rather than simply consenting to be photographed. The collaborative approach also protected Marcus from future appropriation attempts. When subjects were genuine partners in the creative process, it became much more difficult for someone else to claim independent relationships or parallel artistic development. As Marcus prepared for his third major exhibition since the Natalie incident, a retrospective at the Henry Art Gallery showcasing 5 years of community-centered documentary work, he reflected on the unexpected trajectory his career had taken. The gallery walls displayed not just his photographs, but written statements from subjects, documentation of his collaborative process, and educational materials about ethical documentary practice. The exhibition was as much about methodology as it was about artistic vision. At the opening reception, surrounded by the subjects who'd become genuine friends and collaborators, Marcus felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with career advancement or critical recognition. He'd built something meaningful from the wreckage of betrayal, a practice that honored the people who trusted him with their stories. James Clearwater, now 73, approached Marcus near the end of the evening. "You know," he said, gesturing toward Ye, the wall displaying his portrait alongside his own written description of the experience. "This is the first time I've seen my photograph in a gallery where I felt like an equal participant, rather than just a subject." The comment encapsulated everything Marcus had learned about the relationship between artist and subject, between individual ambition and community responsibility. His work was stronger now, not despite the ethical constraints he'd embraced, but because of them. As the reception wound down and guests began departing, Marcus stood alone for a moment in the gallery space, surrounded by images that represented not just artistic achievement, but personal growth, professional integrity, and community partnership. He thought briefly about Natalie, whom he'd heard was working in marketing for a tech company, her photography, ambitions apparently abandoned after the public failure of her appropriation attempt. He felt no satisfaction in her professional disappointment, but rather gratitude that her betrayal had ultimately led him toward more meaningful work. The painful experience had taught Marcus that artistic success without integrity was hollow, that genuine collaboration required transparency and respect, and that protecting other people's creativity was as important as developing his own. Most importantly, he'd learned that the stories we tell through our art matter less than how we treat the people who trust us to tell them. In the end, that lesson had transformed not just his photography, but his entire understanding of what it meant to be an artist in community with others. Walking home through the Seattle streets he'd documented for years, Marcus felt profound gratitude for the difficult journey that had led him to this moment of clarity and purpose. The betrayal that had once threatened to destroy his career had instead become the foundation for work that felt more authentic and impactful than anything he'd created before. That transformation, he realized, was the most important photograph he'd ever developed, not captured on film, but lived through experience and shared with anyone willing to learn from his story. 3 months after the Henry Art Gallery retrospective, Marcus received an unexpected email that would test everything. He'd learned about forgiveness and professional boundaries. The message came from Catherine Morrison at the Cascade Contemporary Gallery in Portland, the same gallery where Natalie had tried to launch her stolen exhibition 2 years earlier. "Dear Marcus," Catherine wrote, "I hope this finds you well. I'm reaching out because we've received an inquiry from Natalie Brooks about potential future exhibition opportunities. Given our history with this situation, I wanted to consult with you before responding to her request." Marcus stared at the email for several minutes, feeling a familiar tightness in his chest that he'd thought was permanently resolved. Natalie was apparently attempting to re-enter the photography world, and she'd chosen to approach the very gallery where her deception had been most publicly exposed. The attached materials Catherine had forwarded showed that Natalie had completely reinvented her artistic narrative once again. Her new portfolio focused on abstract landscape photography, a genre so different from documentary work that it seemed designed to avoid any connection to their shared history. Her artist statement made no mention of her previous unseen voices, project or collaborative work of any kind. But what struck Marcus most was the careful way Natalie had constructed her new professional identity. Her bio described a 2-year hiatus from artistic practice for personal growth and creative exploration, framing her absence from the photography world as intentional artistic development rather than the consequence of exposed fraud. Marcus called Catherine that afternoon, curious about how Natalie had approached the gallery and what she'd said about their previous interaction. She was completely professional, Catherine explained. She acknowledged that there had been complications with her previous submission, but described them as collaborative disputes that had been resolved. She never mentioned the extent of the controversy or the ethical concerns that led us to cancel her exhibition. The conversation revealed that Natalie was systematically approaching galleries throughout the Pacific Northwest, apparently hoping that her new artistic direction and the passage of time would allow her to rebuild her career. Catherine had recognized her name and remembered the controversy, but other galleries might not make the connection. "What are you planning to tell her?" Marcus asked. "That we won't be pursuing an exhibition opportunity at this time," Catherine replied. "But I wanted to check with you first, given how significantly her previous actions affected your work and your subjects." Marcus appreciated Catherine's courtesy, but the situation raised complex questions about redemption, artistic second chances, and the long-term consequences of professional misconduct. Did Natalie deserve the opportunity to rebuild her career in a different artistic medium, or did her previous deception disqualify her from gallery representation permanently? That evening, Marcus discussed the situation with Lisa over dinner at their favorite neighborhood restaurant. She listened thoughtfully as he described his conflicted feelings about Natalie's attempted comeback. "Part of me wants to warn every gallery about what she did," Marcus admitted. "But another part wonders if I should just focus on my own work and let her face whatever consequences come naturally." Lisa, with her museum experience, offered a curator's perspective on the situation. "In the art world, reputation follows you forever," she observed. "If she's trying to rebuild under her real name, eventually someone will make the connection to the controversy. But if she's being dishonest about her history, that creates ongoing ethical problems." The conversation helped Marcus realize that his response to Natalie's comeback attempt would define his own character as much as hers. He could choose to actively campaign against her, warning galleries, posting about her history on social media, or using his growing platform to prevent her from gaining representation. Or he could take a more measured approach, responding honestly when asked, but not initiating efforts to sabotage her career. Over the next week, Marcus researched Natalie's recent activities online. She'd created new professional profiles that carefully omitted any reference to documentary work or collaborative projects. Her Instagram account showed landscape photographs from locations throughout the American West, technically competent, but aesthetically generic images that suggested limited artistic vision. More concerning was evidence that she'd been networking aggressively at photography events, introducing herself to gallery directors and curators without mentioning her controversial history. Several online photography forums included posts from her promoting workshops on artistic reinvention and finding your authentic creative voice, language that seemed deeply ironic given her history of appropriating others' work. Marcus also discovered that Natalie had been quietly reaching out to some of his former subjects, apparently attempting to rebuild relationships that might support her new artistic narrative. Elena Vasquez forwarded him an email she'd received in which Natalie apologized for misunderstandings from their previous interactions and invited Elena to coffee to discuss potential new photography projects. "I thought you should know she's still trying to use your people," Elena wrote in her message to Marcus. "Some of us have long memories about who treated us with respect and who didn't." The revelation that Natalie was still attempting to leverage his subjects for her own purposes convinced Marcus that her supposed artistic transformation was superficial. She was using the same manipulative tactics that had characterized her, theft of his work, simply applied to a different artistic genre. But rather than respond with anger or revenge, Marcus decided to use the situation as a teaching opportunity. During his next ethics seminar at the University of Washington, he presented Natalie's comeback attempt as a case study in professional consequences and rehabilitation. When someone violates professional ethics as seriously as this person did, Marcus explained to his students, the question becomes whether genuine redemption is possible and what that redemption would look like. The discussion that followed was remarkably sophisticated. Students debated whether artistic talent could be separated from ethical behavior, whether the art world had obligations to prevent known bad actors from rebuilding their careers, and what kind of accountability process might allow for genuine rehabilitation. One student, Maya Chen, raised a particularly insightful point. If this person is trying to rebuild by hiding her history, rather than acknowledging and learning from it, doesn't that suggest she hasn't actually changed? The observation crystallized Marcus's own thinking about the situation. Genuine redemption would require Natalie to acknowledge the harm she'd caused, make amends to the people she'd exploited, and demonstrate genuine change through transparent practices. Her current approach suggested she'd learn to be more careful rather than more ethical. Based on this analysis, Marcus decided on a principled response to Natalie's comeback attempt. He wouldn't actively campaign against her, but he would respond honestly when galleries or other professionals asked about their history. More importantly, he would use her case as an ongoing example in his teaching and advocacy work. The decision felt right both ethically and practically. It focused Marcus's energy on protecting future artists rather than relitigating past wrongs, while still ensuring that Natalie's history wouldn't be completely forgotten by the professional community. 6 months later, the wisdom of this approach became apparent. Natalie's attempts to rebuild her career had largely failed, not because of active opposition from Marcus, but because her reputation had preceded her throughout the tight-knit photography community. Gallery directors who initially considered her work ultimately decided against representation after learning about her history through informal professional networks. The few opportunities she did secure proved short-lived. A small gallery in Olympia canceled her solo show after receiving complaints from community members who recognized her name from media coverage of the original controversy. A photography workshop she attempted to lead was poorly attended and received negative reviews that referenced her credibility issues. Marcus learned about these developments through casual conversations with other photographers, not through active monitoring of her activities. The art world's natural accountability mechanisms were working without his direct intervention. Meanwhile, his own career continued flourishing in directions he'd never anticipated. The Stanford collaboration with Dr. Sarah Chen had evolved into a multi-university research project examining artistic ethics across various creative disciplines. Marcus found himself consulting with music conservatories about protecting student composers from exploitation, with film schools about collaboration agreements, and with literary programs about co-authorship disputes. The interdisciplinary work was intellectually stimulating and professionally rewarding, but it also provided perspective on how universal the challenges of creative collaboration really were. Artists in every medium struggled with questions of attribution, appropriation, and the ethics of drawing inspiration from others' work. Marcus's expertise in these areas led to an unexpected opportunity, a fellowship at the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, working on a project about ethical documentation of traditional cultural practices. The position would allow him to spend a year in Washington, D.C., developing protocols for museums and cultural institutions working with indigenous and immigrant communities. The fellowship represented the kind of prestigious recognition that Marcus had always hoped for as a photographer, but achieved through his advocacy work rather than purely artistic accomplishment. It felt like the perfect synthesis of his creative and ethical interests. Lisa, who had been offered a curator position at the National Portrait Gallery, was equally excited about the Washington opportunity. Their relationship had deepened over the past year, built on the foundation of shared values and transparent communication that Marcus now insisted upon in all his partnerships. "It's funny," Lisa observed as they planned their move to Washington. "Your worst professional experience led to your best professional opportunities." The comment prompted Marcus to reflect on the profound ways that trauma could be transformed into wisdom, betrayal into advocacy, and personal pain into community service. His experience with Natalie had certainly been devastating, but it had also catalyzed growth that might never have occurred under more comfortable circumstances. As Marcus prepared to leave Seattle for his Smithsonian Fellowship, he organized a farewell gathering that brought together all the subjects from his various documentary projects. James Clearwater, now a regular collaborator on cultural preservation initiatives, had driven up from the reservation. Elena Vasquez brought her new grandchildren to meet the photographer who'd become a family friend. Duke Nguyen, whose garden had become a neighborhood landmark, shared vegetables he'd grown specifically for the occasion. Looking around the room at these relationships that had evolved from professional interactions into genuine friendships, Marcus felt profound gratitude for the path that had led him to this moment. Each person represented not just a photographic subject, but a teacher who'd helped him understand the responsibility that came with documenting others' lives. During his informal remarks to the gathered group, Marcus reflected on how much his approach to photography had evolved since his early, more extractive documentary work. "When I started taking pictures," he said, "I thought my job was to find interesting subjects and create compelling images. Now I understand that my real job is to honor the trust you've placed in me by sharing your stories." The evening concluded with the presentation of a collaborative photo book that Marcus had created with his subjects. Unlike traditional documentary photography books, this volume included not just images, but extensive written contributions from the people photographed, giving them equal voice in how their stories were told. The book represented everything Marcus had learned about ethical documentary practice, transparent collaboration, ongoing consent, shared authorship, and community benefit. It was being published by a university press and would be distributed free to community organizations working with immigrant and indigenous populations. As guests departed and Marcus cleaned up his apartment one final time before the move to Washington, he found himself thinking about the young photographer he'd been just 3 years earlier. Ambitious, talented, but naive about the complexities of artistic collaboration and professional relationships. That younger version of himself would never have imagined the trajectory his career had taken. The betrayal that had seemed like it might end his artistic dreams had instead launched him toward work that felt more meaningful and impactful than anything he'd previously imagined. Standing in his empty apartment, surrounded by boxes containing not just his photography equipment, but also research materials, teaching notes, and correspondence from artists seeking advice about professional ethics, Marcus felt ready for the next chapter of his journey. The fellowship in Washington would allow him to work at a national level on issues he'd discovered through personal experience, but more importantly, it represented an opportunity to continue transforming individual trauma into collective wisdom, ensuring that other artists might avoid the exploitation he'd experienced while building more ethical practices throughout the creative community. As Marcus loaded the final boxes into his car for the drive to Washington, he realized that the most important lesson from his experience with Natalie wasn't about protecting himself from future betrayals, but about using his platform to protect others. The difference between those two approaches, defensive self-preservation versus proactive community building, represented the true measure of his growth. The painful education in artistic theft and professional betrayal had ultimately taught him that the highest form of creative success wasn't individual recognition or career advancement, but the ability to create conditions where other artists could thrive safely and ethically. That lesson, hard-won through months of conflict and years of recovery, now guided every aspect of his work. And as Marcus drove toward his new life in Washington, he carried with him not just the scars of betrayal, but the deeper wisdom that came from transforming personal pain into lasting positive change for his artistic community. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.